Yes.
You can start.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dina Aladdin, and I welcome you all to our second webinar with Dr. Kamel Bou Hamdan. He's an assistant professor at BAU, and he'll present today his second presentation with us, the key design considerations and the challenges in hydraulic fracturing. And my teammate, Hassan Khalifa, will be our moderator for this webinar. Hassan, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Lynn, and good evening, ladies and gents. So I would like to hope that you enjoy our session for today. Just before we start, I would like to remind you about 15 minutes of Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So enjoy again, and Dr. Kamel, the floor is yours to start the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Lynn. So today, this webinar is going to talk about the key design considerations and the challenges in hydraulic fracturing. So this is a continuation of the previous webinar, which we have introduced hydraulic fracturing. So the outline for this presentation is going to be as follows. First, we are going to look back again at the design parameters. So this is more like a review of the previous webinar. Then we are going to talk about the different interactions between the three main parameters, the rock, the proppant, and the fracturing fluid. After that, we are going to talk about the completion design. So the completion design, from this area, we are going to talk about other terms like stress shadowing. After that, we are going to cover the well spacing. So what's going to be the best location to place our well? We are going to cover this. And we are going to introduce also new terms. And finally, we are going just to make a comparison or a relation between completion design and well spacing. So just a reminder, what's hydraulic fracturing? So this is a method to break down the rock into, or to create fractures within a rock using high pumps of water or fluids. So the applications for hydraulic fracturing can be divided as follows. So we can use it to increase the flow rate if we have a low permeability reservoir. We can use it to increase just the surface area which is in contact with the wellbore. We can also reduce the number of infill wells. So by reducing the number of wells in a certain zone, we are gaining more profits, or our capex and opex are reducing a lot. It's also used to increase the flow rates from wells that have suffered some kind of damage, could be skin damage or anything from drilling. This method, which is hydraulic fracturing, it was shown to be very successful in the US, where we have at least 30% more recoverable reserves of oil and around 90% recovered of gas. So here we can see the different design parameters for hydraulic fracturing. So the first thing we have covered was fracture orientation. By this, we mean the direction of our fracture. So if you look at this image over here, we could have two different directions, either a transverse fracture or a longitudinal fracture. And we have mentioned that the more preferred one in shale rocks is the transverse, because it can extend further into the reservoir. So it can be in contact with more parts of the reservoir. Also, we have the fracturing fluid and the chemicals, which we have said that fracturing fluids is used to break down the rock, and it also transports the proppants into the fracture. Chemicals, those are used to, let's say, to decrease some problems related to fracturing fluids. Then we have mentioned proppants. So proppants are the ones that fill the fracture and prevent it from closing down during production. And in proppants, we have different types. So we might have, let's say, resin-coated ones, uncoated sand. We might have ceramics and so on. We have different sizes as well for proppants. We have different shapes, etc. So we have too many properties related to proppants alone. We also have the multi-stage completion. So in the previous lecture or previous webinar, we have covered that multi-stage completion can be done using perforation techniques. So we do it for every stage alone. However, now we are going to be more focused on the cluster design, which is part of the stage. We are also going to cover the well spacing. So well spacing is another design parameter if we have more than one well to be hydraulically fractured. So if you compare what we have covered in the previous webinar, so the first three has been covered. However, let's say the interaction between proppants and the fluids and also the rock has not been really covered. Multi-stage completion and well spacing, they will be covered in today's webinar. So starting with the interaction of the three main parameters. If you look at this image over here, we have a rock, as you can see, and it has a fracture within it. So this is a fracture, and inside the fracture, you can see the sand, which behaves now as a proppant. So this sand is filling parts of the fracture. If you look at the arrows over here, this tells us that, okay, we have a pathway for the fluids to pass through this direction. So in hydraulic fracturing, we need these three main parameters: the fluid inside the fracture, the proppants, and how they behave or how they interact with the rocks. So first, let's start with the rock and fluid interaction. So here we have a case, we're studying the Bacon Shale, and we are checking what's changing to its hardness. So hardness, it's a surface parameter of a rock. So how hard is it or how soft it is? This is a parameter, let's say Brinell hardness over here, it can measure this value. So as Brinell hardness has a higher value, then the rock is going to be harder. If this is of lower value, then we have a softer rock. So initially this rock was tested before being in contact with fluids, and it was found to be in this range. So let's say between 30 and 60 for Brinell hardness. So what happens to the rock when we introduce the fracturing fluid? So here we have two cases where water has been used. This is slick water, and here we have gel also added to it. If you look at the Brinell hardness now, you can find that it has decreased a lot. So the lowest was 30 over here, and now it's something around 15. So the rock, it was hard, and now it became soft. If you look at other fracturing fluids or fluids that don't really have water inside them, or let's say they are concentrated with brine, then you can find that they have minimal effect or no effect on the rock itself. So they're not really changing the hardness of the rock. So this is one important thing to consider between the fracturing fluid and the rock, that the water itself, or the slick water, is going to decrease the hardness of the rock. Now, why is this important? We are going to cover it in the next, later in this presentation. Now, another thing for the rock fluid interaction, which is more related to the pad stage, is the depending on the rock type or rock properties and on the fracturing fluid which is used. So if you consider or look at these two images, so here we have a hydraulic fractured well, and you can see there is a complicated network. So this network is also fractures, could be micro fractures. Over here is just the fracture itself, the big one, and we don't really have other micro fractures. So when do we get this case during fracturing, and when do we get the other case? So for here, we should look at the properties of the rock. So if we have a rock which is, let's say, brittle meaning this rock doesn't really undergo plastic deformation. So it might withstand a little bit elastic stresses, and after that, it's going to break down or it's going to fracture. So if our rock is brittle, you're most probably going to get something like that. It's going to be complicated fractures extending in different directions. If our rock was ductile, so ductile meaning it can withstand large plastic deformations before reaching a fracturing phase. So you're probably going to get something like that. So this rock doesn't really break down easily. So it's just going to create this large opening over here. And besides that, you're just going to have very little or negligible fractures. So that's one way to differentiate between these two if we are talking about the different rock property. What about the fracturing fluid that is being used? So if we are using stick water or if we are using cross-linked gel. So the main difference between them is the viscosity. Slick water, it's less viscous than the cross-linked one. Because they are less viscous, they can penetrate small or smaller pore sizes. So if we are using slick water, we're most probably going to get something similar to this one as well, because slick water can penetrate small pore sizes and they can extend more towards our rock. So they can break it at further locations. For cross-linked gel, they cannot really penetrate small pores, so they have to look at the larger pores. So you're probably going to get first the larger fracture size like this, and after that, there will be minimal or no extension for the fracture itself. Okay, now I'm just going to review again the term fracture conductivity, as it's going to be very important for our next parts. So fracture conductivity in terms of equation, it's multiplication of permeability by the width. Here the permeability, this refers to the permeability of the proppant pack we have inside the fracture. So you know the fracture is going to be filled with proppants, like here. So these proppants are going to have a certain permeability which is passing through them. WF is the fracture width, what's the opening of this fracture. So if you multiply them together, we are going to get this term, which is fracture conductivity. And in terms of meaning, it is almost the same, or it can relate to permeability. So it's just the ease of the fluid to pass from one location to the other. So if it can easily pass from, let's say, the left side to the right side, this means that we have a high fracture conductivity, so our fracture is efficient. Okay, let's look at these images over here, starting with the left side, those three. If you look at the difference between them, you can easily tell that it's the number of proppants or the concentration of proppants within this region. So the first one, we have like 3 up to 4 layers of proppants. The second one over here, we have just a single layer and they are all close to each other. So hence we can say this is a monolayer arrangement. The first one is a packed arrangement. The last case, we have also a single layer, but we have large spaces between the proppants. So this is called a partial monolayer arrangement. Now, if you're going to compare these three together, which one do you think is going to have the highest fracture conductivity, and which one is going to have the lowest? If you can write in the chat box, which do you think is going to be the highest fracture conductivity and which one is going to be the lowest from only these three images? Okay, so we have a few answers. Anyone else wants to guess? Okay, so the highest, it's going to be the partial monolayer. This is going to have the largest fracture conductivity, assuming, of course, we are talking about the same proppant size. Why is going to be the highest? Because we have large opening. So in terms of the permeability value itself, we have very high permeability over here. Fluids can easily pass through these openings to the other side. In terms of lowest conductivity, it's going to be the monolayer one. So the monolayer is just a single layer of proppants close to each other. So you can see the pore spaces, they are very few. Compared to the packed proppant, here we have more pore spaces or voids between the proppants. Therefore, this is going to have a higher fracture conductivity than the monolayer case. So first it's partial monolayer, then it's the packed or the multi-layer, and after that it's going to be the monolayer having the lowest conductivity. Okay, so if that's the case, then we should always go with partial monolayer. Isn't that right? So it's going to give us the highest fracture conductivity. Well, that's not really going to be the case. So the problem with partial monolayer is during production, you're going to have additional stresses acting on the fracture. So those additional stresses are going to kind of either break down the proppants or they are going to cause the fracture to close on itself. So you can see the image over here. What happened to the, let's say, the fracture width or the permeability? It has decreased a lot due to this problem, proppant breaking down or maybe fines creation of the rocks and so on. If you look at the monolayer case, we also have proppants breaking down. However, fewer proppants compared to the partial monolayer case were broken down. So here, almost all of them broke down, whereas here we have like maybe 2 or 3 out of 6. But still, the conductivity is going to decrease even further. What about the packed one? So if you look at this here, you also have proppants breaking down. However, we still have some voids or pore spaces between the proppants. So if you're considering the pressure, the increase in pressure in the fracture during production, of course, we are going to choose to go with the packed proppants instead of going with monolayers or partial monolayers. So this one might stay or might still have a good permeability or good conductivity. However, the other cases, they might in the end have a 0 or very low conductivity. Okay, here we have a test, a crush test that was done on different kinds of proppants having different layers. So here we tested the sand, the resin-coated sands, the ceramic and lightweight ceramics. The pressure was 10,000 psi and the proppant size were between 20 and 40 mesh. So you can see that the percentage of crushed proppants is changing for all of them. If we have higher percentage of crushed proppants, this can relate to larger loss in fracture conductivity. So more crushed proppants means we are losing our fracture conductivity more. First, if we look at the where the curves start, that's like half. So here we are talking about a partial monolayer case. You can see that all the proppants don't really care about the type of it. Even ceramics, even the resin ones, they have large or high percentage of crushed proppants. So we are really losing a lot of our fracture conductivity. Moving to the one layer, which is the monolayer case, you can see that the percentage of crushed have decreased a lot for all of them. For ceramic ones, which is this curve over here, it is kind of acceptable. Now it's below 20%. However, for the others, it's still somewhere like 50% or more. So what's really happening as we are increasing the number of layers, you can see that the percentage of crushed proppants is getting lower. So this shows us that we should aim to get as many layers as possible to save our fracture conductivity and prevent it from reaching a very low values. Here you can see that the 1 pound per feet squared for bauxite, which is ceramic, or the concentration, it only creates a 3.5 layers. However, the sands create 6 layers. Why is that? Because if you're going to compare a sand particle with a ceramic particle, there is a large difference between the densities of these two. Therefore, sand at this concentration is going to give us more layers. Okay, let's look here again at the rocks. So the rock proppant interaction. if we have a soft rock or ductile rock, and if we have a hard, brittle rock. So if you have a soft one, you can see that we have a phenomenon called embedment. So the proppant itself, it's not really breaking down, but it's kind of entering or being embedded inside the rock itself. So if this is happening, what happens to our fracture conductivity? So if we had previously, our fracture, or let's say our width, was at the edges of the proppant, so it was all of this, the original width. Now our width have decreased probably around half. So our fracture conductivity has been highly damaged or highly affected. It decreased a lot. And you're talking about the soft rock. Now, if you go back to the interaction between the rocks and the fluids, we said if we are using slick water, or if we're using, let's say, cross-linked gel, we are kind of decreasing the hardness of the rock. So it's getting softer. So once this happens, this phenomenon it can occur more rapidly. Therefore, we should always consider the fluid we are using, and we should take into consideration that embedment will almost always occur for shale rocks if they are soft and ductile. If we are talking about a hard and brittle rock, then what's going to happen is that the proppant is going to break down, or the rock itself is going to break and starts generating some fines. Whether any of these occurs is going to also reduce our fracture conductivity. So imagine some fines from the rock enter our fracture, or maybe fill it, or maybe go towards the perforations and close the perforations. So all of that is going to reduce our fracture conductivity. Moving on to the third interaction, which is between the proppant and the fluid. Mainly focusing on the proppant transport, how we can transport proppants from the well into our fracture. So assuming all of this gray is our fracture and the well bore is somewhere over here, you can see that during transportation, most of the proppant concentration is going to be somewhere close to our well bore. It's not really going to reach the fracture tips. So somewhere over here, just very few proppants are going to be deposited at a further or a larger extent. So that's something you should be considered. And the proppant transport depends a lot on the type of fluid you are using, whether it's slick water or cross-linked one, and the types of proppants you are using. So we can basically summarize this process in this figure over here. So first, at the first corner, we have a brittle rock, and here we have a ductile rock. So if we have a ductile rock, you would expect our fractures to be large, but near the well bore. If you have a brittle one, our fractures are going to be very complicated, complex. For ductile ones, we most use the cross-linked gel, and it's going to have a large amount of proppants as well. So lots of proppants filling our fracture, keeping our conductivity high. For brittle ones, we use slick water, and we don't really use large amounts of proppants because our fracture width is already not that large. It's kind of small, so it cannot really fill too many layers of proppants. Anything in between, we can use other kinds of fluids, so linear gel, foam, hybrid, or so on. Regarding the transportation, we can say that it's almost perfect for a cross-linked gel because it's heavier or more viscous, and it's less perfect or imperfect if we are using slick water fracturing fluids. Okay, so now that covers the first part of our presentation. Now moving on to the completion design. So the completion design, as we said, we should have in the end multi-stage fracture, and every stage can be presented as this figure over here. So we have a cluster, and we have some spacing between the clusters. We have perforation holes that's obtained from our perforation guns. And we are going to have plugs which separate this stage from another stage. So every cluster, it represents a single perforation gun. And as you can see here, we have some kind of spacing between them. Over here is somehow between 25 and 100 feet. If we are talking about the frac stage itself, it could be between 150 up to 500 feet. Okay, so what should we consider, or what should we look at in the cluster or the stage design? Now we have this study from this SPE paper. It shows that they have done several simulations by changing the number of clusters, the cluster spacing, and the stage length. So they basically changed the number of clusters per stage. They changed the distance between every cluster, and they changed also the stage length. So what were the results? They found that reduction in cluster spacing, we had an improved well performance. So as cluster spacing decreases, as those become closer to each other, we had a better or an improved well performance. And this was due to better connection with the reservoir. So our well bore has more connection with the rock itself. It has more clusters, so it's better connected to the reservoir. So that was the first finding. Moving on to the next study, they also did several simulations. They varied the number of clusters per well. So that's per well and not per stage. They also looked at the cluster spacing and the different stages. Here they assumed that we have a fixed number of clusters per stage. The main scenarios were two, so either 15 stages or 20 stages per well. Now, since our condition is that we have constant number of clusters, this means that the 20 stage has more clusters than the 15 stage. We have also a fixed geometry. So what were the results? Here, the 15 stage scenario, which has lower clusters and more cluster spacing, showed that it outperforms the 20 stage scenario for long-term recovery. So here we are saying that the larger our cluster spacing, we're going to have better recovery of hydrocarbons. So if you compare the first study and the second study, they are actually opposite to each other. So the first one, it says that if we reduce the cluster spacing, the performance of the well improves, whereas the second one says if we increase the cluster spacing, we are going to get a better performance of the well, and we are going to produce more hydrocarbons. So what should we do? Should we go with the lower sized or lower spacing or the larger spacing? If you look at the second study again, they found out that the 15th stage, which has lower clusters, it was able to hold more amounts of proppants. So if it holds more amounts of proppants, this means that the fracture itself, it's larger than the fracture, let's say fracture area of the 20 stage. So the 15 stage scenario can hold more proppants, has a bigger or larger fracture geometry than the 20 stage case. Now this can be attributed to something we call stress shadowing. What's stress shadowing? This is depending on the stresses in the subsurface. These stresses are going to change, or they're going to be manipulated based on our hydraulically fractured wells. So once we fracture a reservoir, let's say the first stage over here, we have filled it with fracturing fluids, we have high pressure over here, and now the pressures next to it are going to change. So we might also have our minimum horizontal stress probably moving to a different direction at nearby areas. And if this happens, you can find something like that, like the 4 and 5. If you look at the fracture propagation from this end, you can see that it's very small width. 5 as well. It's not really propagating in this direction anymore. It's propagating in another direction. So the fractures, or yes, the fractures and the stages 1 to 3 have affected the stresses in this area, and this caused a change in the propagation for the fractures. The same thing happens with the clusters. So we have, let's say, 5 clusters per stage. some clusters might have limited entry. So the perforations might not be open as the others, and you might also get something like that within the clusters. So somewhere we might have fractures propagating more than the nearby clusters. Moving on to the third thing, which is the well spacing. So why is well spacing important? If you think about it, if we can find the best location to place our well, then we can easily enhance our well productivity. So let's say we have a certain region or certain area. If we know the optimum space for the wells, so instead of let's say drilling and fracking 8 wells, we might do it with 5 wells or 4 wells and so on. So it's more benefit for the economy. Unconventional reservoirs, they are of poor permeability. So the permeability is lower than 0.1 millidarcies. We are going to need more than 1 fractured well within a geological area. But the problem here we are going to face is the interference. So interference is when the nearby wells are kind of affecting each other. So we are fracking 2 nearby wells. We might have, let's say, maybe proppants propagating from one well to the other, maybe fracturing fluids and so on. So this is an important phenomenon that occurs with well spacing. So what kind of interference we might have? Here we have 4 different cases. So the first one is when we have a new well, which is being drilled, and you have an adjacent well which is being stimulated, or you are applying hydraulic fracturing. So think about it. If you are drilling a well and you are fracking a well nearby, what might happen is that during drilling, the pore pressure inside the rocks which are being fractured is going to increase a little bit due to the fracturing fluid entering the rock. So when this happens, your pore pressure while drilling is going to be kind of different than what you were estimating. So everyone should know that when you are drilling to place, let's say, the casing and to choose your mud weight, you should look at the pore pressure gradient and the fracture pressure gradient. So assuming your pore pressure gradient has increased a little bit because of our fractured well, then let's say you might, for some reason, enter in an underbalanced conditions where you are drilling below the pore pressure. If this happens, then it's going to be a problem. You might have a kick, maybe a blowout. So these things should be considered while drilling. You might have a child well which is being stimulated while a parent well is in production. By child well, I mean here a new well, and the parent well is an old stimulated well which is now put on in production. So if we have this case, you might also have some problems. The child well might affect the parent well which is in production. Another case when you have 2 wells in production, so assuming they are connected with each other, so the amount of, let's say, produced hydrocarbons is going to be lower, or it could be affected if this is the case. So we have something like pressure depletion. It might be depleting even further than what's expected. You might also have 2 adjacent wells that are being stimulated. So it's like we have fracturing 2 wells close to each other. How is this going to affect our, or you might have some kind of interference with this case. Okay, if we look here, we have an image of 2 wells, and we are doing hydraulic fracturing. So we have already placed our proppants, and we have the completion fluids over here, and this is the second case. Now, if you look at these 2 images, which one do you think is more, or it's better for it to occur? Is it the first one or is it the second one? Which one is more preferable to happen? Which one do you think? So is it the first figure or the second figure? What we
هلا نحن ما بدنا يصير في interference بيناتهم so الحصة الأولى.
Okay, so someone saying second, so others are saying the first. Okay. So what's really happening over here? We have a term we call frag hits. Frag hits, it means when two wells or two hydraulically fractured wells interfere together. So in this case, there's no frag hits because the completion fluids did not really reach the other side of the well. So for this case, we can say that the wells are actually too wide from each other. The completion did not reach, they are far from each other. The second case, we have a frag hit because the completion fluids have crossed each other. So again, which is going to be the optimum well spacing? Well, you should look at it from another perspective. We don't really need interference between the wells, that's true. As we can, or if we can avoid interference, that's going to be better. However, here, the interference is between completion fluids and not really between proppants. So what does this tell us? Let's say we have finished our stimulation and now we are going to produce. If you put the wells in production, the completion fluid over here is going to be produced again. So you're going to produce all of this fluid. So what's going to happen to the rock in this region over here? Since fluid is no longer there and there is no proppants as well, so the rock itself is really going to close again. So once the rock closes again, and the interference has been really broken. So now well 1 and well 2 are no longer in contact with each other. So in reality, we prefer this to occur. We prefer frag hits to occur because they can give us an idea of the maximum or the maximum well spacing. If we're talking about this case, so the completion fluids did not really, let's say, cross path. And we are now producing the well, so the rock is going to close again here and here. We don't really know the space or what's hidden in this region over here. So you might have, let's say, large amounts of hydrocarbons. The distance might be really wide, wider than what's shown in this image. So we are kind of losing this area which is between well 1 and well 2. This area is no longer stimulated. Therefore, we prefer frag hits because we are able to stimulate all of the areas, and in the same time, the proppants did not really interact together. So in interference, we are looking at these things: the frag hits, pressure interference, short-term production interference, and the long-term EUR interference. So frag hits, this occurs only during the completion while you are, let's say, stimulating the wells. This is a good indicator of the maximum well spacing. So when frag hits occur, this means that, okay, this is the maximum spacing between the wells that should be. But it's not really the optimum spacing, it's just the maximum. The optimum might be even of lower spacing or closer spacing between the wells. Pressure interference, this could occur during, let's say, production or for doing some pressure tests. What we'll observe here is that we have some kind of pressure communication. So if the pressure decreases in the first well, it's also decreasing in the second well. So this is another kind of interference that occurs between the wells. This is not also very preferred, but sometimes it's okay. It doesn't really create big problems. The third thing is the short-term production interference. So in this case, we are looking at the early stage of the well life. So let's say we have just produced our fluids in the flowback period. So, okay, we have this kind of interference, but it might not really be a long-term production interference. Therefore, it is fine. So we don't really mind having this kind of interference. Now, what would be a big problem is the long-term EUR interference. EUR stands for Estimated Ultimate Recovery Interference. So here we are saying that this well is going to be affected by the nearby well for the rest of its life. So this is not something good for it to happen because it's kind of like the spacing, it is too tight or too close to each other. However, if we are doing it for, let's say, research purposes or studying the effect of well interference, then that's the best way to do this or to study this parameter. So that's all about the well spacing interference. Now let's look at the comparison of the relation between completion design and the well spacing. So okay, here we have an image. The first one on the left, we have small jobs, or let's say small completion designs. You can say that we have, let's say, lower amounts of proppants, lower amount of fracturing fluids, less or lower number of clusters. So that's basically the small job. When we talk about the super large job, here we mean that we have many stages, we have many clusters, proppants, and so on. So how does this affect our estimated ultimate recovery and in comparison with the spacing between the two wells? So for this case over here, we have two wells, small job, but they are very wide apart. Now the estimated ultimate recovery here, it gives us a factor of 1. However, as we mentioned previously, that here we have an area which is unstimulated. So this rock over here, it cannot really be produced unless we, let's say, drill another well and do another hydraulic fracturing over here. If we are talking about a small job where we have tight spacing, you can see that they are almost connecting with each other. So our EUR over here is 0.9. So the best or the optimum case is to be somewhere between tight spacing and the wide spacing. So if the blue envelope, let's say, of this sphere and that one interact with each other, then that's going to be the optimum one, and you might have the maximum EUR. Moving on to the super large jobs, here you can see the effect of spacing on it. So if we have a tight spacing, you can see that we have large interference between the two wells. What happens to our EUR is going to be much lower than what would be expected if we have an optimum case, which is over here, the wide spacing. So here we have the optimum case, which is 1. So that's how spacing, let's say, depends heavily on the completion design we are looking at. So for this case, it's more preferred to have a tight or a little bit further away from tight than to have a tight spacing if we have a large completion. Here we have an example of the Permian Basin. So we have 8 different wells, and the x-axis shows the space or the lateral distance between the wells. So the first, or let's say the first 4 wells, they had a spacing of 3,168. There were no frac hits observed for these wells. So obviously these wells are very far away from each other. Next, they drilled or they fractured 3 other wells with a spacing of 1,320 miles between them. They also observed no frac hits. So the fracture is not really propagating for a large distance. After that, they did another well of lower spacing or closer to the other wells. It was just 1,056 miles, and we had a frac hits. So what does this tell us? That the first one over here, this is like the maximum well spacing that should be used for all of our future fractured wells. So if we can maybe even reduce a little bit the spacing, it might even be better for our production. Here we are looking at the effect of interference for a case. Here we have a constant geometry, and we have different wells. So the first scenario shows 4 wells in this area. However, these 4 wells are located at the optimum spacing. So that's the optimum spacing for the wells. If we have the same geometry, but we have 8 wells which are lower than the optimum spacing. So what happens to our production and what happens to our pressures? If we look at the first one, or the blue one, this represents the upper example. You can see that we have high oil rates or high oil productions for a long period of time. So here we're talking about 500 days, and it's still kind of acceptable for the well, 700 barrels per day. If you look at the wells for the second case over here, you can see that it's kind of dropping rapidly especially after, let's say, the 200 or 200 something days. So here it's dropping to a low level. So why is this occurring? We should look at the pressure profiles. What's happening to our pressures? So if you look at the tubing head pressures with production days, for the blue case, which is for here, you can see that the pressure is kind of decreasing, but it's not decreasing as rapidly as the other case. So here it is decreasing, but still kind of high. It's still kind of can support the production of hydrocarbons. However, the orange one over here, it drops to below 500 psi just before the days 200 days, and this, of course, is going to affect our production. So if you are doing this similar case, if we choose the first one, then we have reduced the cost of 4 other wells, and we have gained more, let's say, oil over a longer period of time. So we have really increased the productivity life of our well as well. So as a summary of today's presentation, we have covered the rock and fluid interaction. We have covered the fluid proppant interaction as well, the rock proppant interaction. We also covered the completion designs and the term, which is stress shadow. We covered well spacing and the importance of frac hits in determining the optimum spacing design. We also looked at the comparison between completion design and well spacing. So finally, if you like this topic, if you want to discuss more about it with me, you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can email me on my email over here. And thank you for attending this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kamel, for your presentation. So now let's proceed for the Q&A session. Please, if you have any question, please write it down in the chat. So our first question for today's session would be from Abbas Shukr. How much can we increase the fracture width, and what are the limitations?
Okay, so the fracture width, it depends on the rock type. It depends on the rate you are applying the, let's say, the fracturing fluid. So all of these are going to affect our fracture width. How much you can extend it, there's not really a certain value for it, but you can keep it high during production by, let's say, pumping larger sized proppants. So filling your wellbore, near wellbore region with large sized proppants, so you can keep a large fracture width near that area.
So a second question was, what about the proppant size factor? How it would affect the fracture openings?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What about the proppant size factor? How it affects the fracture opening?
Okay, so obviously if we are using a larger proppant size, we are going to have a larger fracture. And if we are allowed to use a larger one, then we should do it. However, not all the fractures can allow large proppants to be used. So some fractures are kind of very low width, let's say 0.6 millimeters. So you cannot really use the large proppants. You'll have to start with the smaller ones, fill the, let's say, the fracture tips as much as possible, and then start increasing your proppants as much as possible as well.
Okay, we have another question from Mohammed Balushi. What can we do as an industry moving forward to mitigate and reduce the potential impact of fracking, like induced seismicity, while also continuing to proceed with the action of hydraulic fracturing?
Okay, so in the previous webinar, we have really covered the environmental effect caused by hydraulic fracturing, and we have highlighted the main reasons why we might have some kind of, let's say, contamination of fresh water or harming the environment. So the main reasons are either a bad cement job, so we need to work more on the cement integrity, the casing as well. We don't want any leakage to occur from our well into the areas which is where we have the fresh water. The second thing that might occur, however, it doesn't really occur that much, is if we have a fault plane. So that's an old fault plane which is going to be induced by our fracture. If this happens, then it might create a pathway from our reservoir towards the surface. So how we can avoid that is by checking our, let's say, geological maps where we have the previous faults, the old faults. We have these maps, they are within the company's reach. So if they find we have a fault zone, try to stay away as much as possible from that zone, and you can do the fractures over there. So basically these two methods can decrease or kind of prevent environmental damage.
So we have another question from Mahdi Darwish. What are the signs or indications that that shows or indicate that we have frac hits?
Okay, so if you're going to have a frac hit, so okay, going back to this image, if you have a frac hit, so you're going to have, let's say the fluids are interacting together from well 1 and well 2. If you are in well 2 and the frac hits occur, you are going to find a sudden increase in the tubing head pressure. So there is some kind of disturbance for your pressure profile once the frac hits occur, and that's going to be an indication that, okay, we have some kind of interaction.
So we have a question from Dr Kamel. Many studies showed that partial monolayer gives higher conductivity than monolayer and multilayer, even after decrease of effective stress during production, based on Eagle Ford Shale, Texas A&M. Do you think that the partial monolayer theory is valid? And what factors may affect its validity? Is it the stiffness of the rock?
Okay, regarding the partial monolayer. Yes, in some cases, you might have that the partial monolayer may maintain its high conductivity, even after closing. However, that's of course not for all the types of rocks we have. So if the, let's say the proppant does not break down and the fracture stays open, then yes, our partial monolayer, it's the best case.
Okay, we have a question from Ali Hamdan. What can be done to improve the transportation of proppant using slick water?
However, you should consider these things. That first, you cannot really control the arrangement, so it's very hard. The partial monolayer, here you're going to have to look at the rock properties. When you have a single layer or a partial monolayer, the properties of the rock themselves are what controls, let's say, the embedment case and the cracking or fracturing of the proppants. So here, if it's ductile, we're going to have an embedment and the proppant or the, let's say, the rock itself is going to close. How we can prevent this is by using packs of proppants. So let's look at this image over here. We have some kind of embedment. However, it didn't really close the fracture because we have a pack. However, for a partial monolayer, it was closed because we just have this small layer. So therefore, partial monolayer might be better in certain cases, but it's very hard to create it in reality. Therefore, they prefer not to do it.
Okay, we have another question from Mahdi Darwish. Why do some shale rocks behave as brittle and others as ductile?
Okay, so the reason for that is that shales, they are very heterogeneous rocks. Not all the shales are the same. You have to look at the mineral contents. So shale is like a combination of, let's say, some carbonates, some quartz, and some clay. In addition to that, we have the organic matter. You have also to look at the confining stresses. So any rock which is applied to confining stresses, high confining stresses, it starts to behave more as a ductile than a brittle rock. So we have many factors from the mineralogical point of view and from the confining stresses point of view.
So also we have Ibrahim Rida asking you to elaborate on one, the interference between a child well being stimulated and a parent well in production.
Okay, so talking about this case where we have a child well being stimulated and we have a parent well in production. So if you have a well which is in production, what's happening, the pore pressure inside the fracture is going to decrease. So we have a lower pore pressure in the fracture compared to the original rock or the nearby rocks. When this happens and we are going to stimulate a well close by, the propagation of the fracture would prefer to go in the direction of the minimum, let's say, pore pressures. So when this happens, you might have the newly fractured well going towards the previous or the parent well, and it might cross it as well. So you might have the new well or the new already fractured well entering or crossing the parent well.
Okay, now we have Ayman Farhat asking, we have the MEM and GEM. We can have the geomechanical parameters. We know the least and maximum principal stresses. We know if the rock is ductile or brittle, and so on. So can you accurately predict the structure and the shape of the fracture network that will occur and how it will perform?
No, it's very hard to predict it, even if you have all of these informations, because it's very complicated phenomenon or how the stresses change. Therefore, you can see that all of the, let's say, the researchers nowadays are trying to figure out the fracture propagation using numerical simulation softwares. So they try to draw out or predict the parameters we have. They put it inside our models and start to, let's say, create the pressures, which are due to fracturing fluids and proppants, and they check how the fractures are moving. So it's a very complicated process, and it's almost impossible to have it written down by, let's say, an equation. You need a numerical software to predict that.
Okay, guys, do you have any more questions for Dr. Kamel? Okay, we'd like to thank you, Dr. Kamel, for such an insightful and beneficial PowerPoint presentation you've shared with us. And we'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar. And of course, I'd like to remind you that more is yet to come in the future. And thank you for attending again. Hope you enjoyed our webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Kamel.
Okay, you're welcome all. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you all.